He was standing in a showroom that smelled like new leather and someone's idea of success, with engine grease still drying in the lines of his knuckles, and a 5-year-old daughter gripping his left hand like it was the only solid thing in the building. Nobody looked at them twice. Or rather, everybody looked at them twice and then decided there was nothing worth seeing. That was the thing about Garrett Landon. He had spent the better part of 3 years making sure he looked like exactly what he was. A mechanic, a father, a man who fixed other people's machines and went home and made dinner and read the same picture book 4 nights in a row because his daughter liked the page with the fox. What nobody in that showroom understood, what nobody in this town understood except 2 people who worked for him, was that the quiet man in the worn canvas jacket had once been the youngest lead powertrain engineer in the history of the American Le Mans series, and that the patent royalties depositing into an account he barely touched could have bought every car on that polished floor without requiring a phone call to anyone. But that was a different life. That life had a wife in it. Drop a comment with your city. Let's see how far this story reaches. The morning had started the way Garrett's mornings always started, with a foot in his stomach. Rosie slept like she was performing a slow-motion martial arts demonstration. She'd migrated from her bed to his sometime around 2 in the morning, which he knew because he'd woken briefly when her elbow connected with his jaw and had spent the remaining hours gradually rotating until she was perpendicular across the mattress with one bare foot planted firmly in his midsection. He lay there for a minute, staring at the ceiling fan that wobbled on the second speed, listening to his daughter breathe, that sound. The specific unconscious rhythm of a child who trusted the world completely because she hadn't yet learned not to. It was the thing he organized his entire life around, that sound, and most mornings it was enough to make the rest of it feel manageable. He extracted himself without waking her, padded to the kitchen, started the coffee maker, a drip machine so old it sounded like it was translating from another language. Abigail had bought it at a yard sale their 2nd year of marriage because she thought it had character. It did have character. It also had a crack in the reservoir that he'd sealed with food-grade epoxy 3 times. He could have replaced it. He didn't want to replace it. Most things in the kitchen were still arranged the way Abigail had arranged them. The mugs on the left side of the cabinet, the cutting boards standing upright behind the toaster. The small ceramic bowl on the windowsill that had held her rings when she washed dishes. It was empty now. It had been empty for 3 years. He kept it there because moving it felt like a decision he wasn't ready to make, and because leaving it felt like a way of saying that the person who'd put it there still mattered in this room. He stood at the window with his coffee and looked at the yard. The fence needed staining. There was a lawnmower engine block sitting on the back porch that Rosie had claimed as a project, and was slowly disassembling with the focus of a very small and very determined archaeologist. Tools were arranged around it in a pattern that she had explained to him in detail and that he was not permitted to disturb. Garrett Landon was 34. He was 6 feet even, built lean from actual labor rather than intention, with hands that carried permanent shadows of graphite and oil in the creases, no matter how long he scrubbed. His hair was dark and too long, and he cut it himself when it started getting in his eyes, which meant it always looked like it had been cut by someone who was thinking about something else at the time. He had a scar across the bridge of his nose from a torque wrench that had slipped when he was 22. People sometimes asked about it. He never told the same story twice, because the real story wasn't interesting, and making things up amused him in a quiet way. He ran a garage called Landon & Sons on the south end of Crestfield, a town in central Virginia that had been slowly becoming a suburb of somewhere larger for 20 years without ever quite arriving. The name was aspirational in a way that had once been a joke between him and Abigail, because there were no sons, just him, and now there was a daughter who could identify a cam lobe by profile at age 5. The shop occupied a converted service station with 2 working bays, a parts room that smelled like brake cleaner and old rubber, and an office the size of a closet where the filing cabinet doubled as a lunch table. He had 2 employees, Sal Petrosky, who was 58 and had been fixing engines since before electronic fuel injection existed and regarded computers with the specific suspicion of a man who remembered carburetors, and Tessa Yoon, who was 27, had a mechanical engineering degree from Virginia Tech, and had taken a job at the garage 2 years ago for reasons she described as a gap year, and showed no signs of leaving. She was the best diagnostician Garrett had ever worked with, who wasn't himself. He hadn't told her that. He suspected she knew. The garage did honest work, steady, unspectacular good. Fleet contracts with a regional delivery company, regular maintenance for the county's older residents who trusted a place where the owner answered the phone himself, and occasionally, finding their way in by word of mouth, restoration projects. Classic cars. The kind of work that required patience and specific knowledge, and the willingness to spend 3 hours tracking a vacuum leak that a dealer would have solved by replacing the entire assembly. Nobody who brought their truck to Landon & Sons had any idea, and Garrett had spent considerable effort making sure of that. The idea that the man handing back their keys in a shirt with someone else's motor oil on it had, before he was 30, led the powertrain development team that won the 12 hours of Sebring, that he held 6 patents on turbocharger thermal management systems currently licensed by manufacturers in Stuttgart and Yokohama, that he had co-founded a company called Vortex Propulsion Systems that had been acquired for $370 million in a deal that closed 14 months after his wife's funeral, negotiated almost entirely by his attorneys while he sat in rooms and stared at walls. He hadn't needed to work again. He'd chosen to. Not for the money, for the noise. The useful, honest noise of a wrench on a bolt, and a problem with a solution, and a day that ended with something fixed that had been broken in the morning. Because silence for Garrett had become the sound grief made when it had nowhere else to go. He got Rosie up at 7. This was a process. You didn't wake a 5-year-old. You created conditions under which a 5-year-old might choose to become conscious. Toast in the toaster. Lights in the hallway. The bathroom door opened so the nightlight spilled into the corridor. Strategic patience. Rosie appeared at 7:12, barefoot, dragging a stuffed rabbit whose name was Professor and whose left ear had been resewn so many times it was structurally more thread than fabric. Under her other arm was the notebook. She carried it everywhere. It was a cheap composition book, black and white marbled cover, and every page was full of drawings. Engines, mostly. Cross-sections. Exploded views. The kind of technical illustration that would have been impressive from an adult and was slightly unnerving from a kindergartner. Not accurate, exactly, but attentive. The drawings of someone who watched closely and remembered what she saw. There was one on the refrigerator that Garrett looked at every morning. Rosie's interpretation of a flat-6 engine, all confident circles and emphatic arrows, with a small figure standing on top that she'd labeled Dad fixing in capital letters with the X backwards. Pancakes? She said, climbing into her chair. Toast. She considered this. Toast with stuff on it? Peanut butter. That's acceptable, she said, which was a word she'd learned from Tessa and now used with alarming frequency. They ate. Rosie talked about a situation at school involving a girl named Bethany and a disagreement about whether caterpillars had bones. Garrett listened and drank his coffee and understood, in the way he understood it most mornings, that this unremarkable kitchen in this unremarkable house was the center of everything that mattered to him. He needed parts. This was the perpetual condition of running an independent garage. You were always sourcing something. Today it was a set of ignition components for a 1971 Datsun 240Z he was restoring for a client, and the only supplier who'd had the correct distributor cap in stock was Caldwell Automotive. He knew the name. Everybody in the regional automotive world knew the Caldwell name. Marin Caldwell had built the family dealership into a network. 4 franchises, a luxury pre-owned division, a concierge service department that handled the kind of vehicles that arrived on covered trailers. The flagship on Ashburn Boulevard was the kind of building that had been designed by someone who understood that architecture was sales by other means. Glass and brushed steel and lighting that made the cars look like they existed in a more expensive version of reality. Garrett had been there once before. Quick parts pickup. In and out, he loaded Rosie into the truck, a 12-year-old Tacoma that ran like new because he maintained it himself. She had Professor in one hand and the notebook in the other. Are we going to the shiny place? Parts pickup. Can I bring Professor? Professor's already in the truck, Rosie. She looked down at the rabbit, then back at him. He wanted to make sure. Caldwell Automotive's Ashburn Boulevard location was objectively a serious building. Through the windows, the inventory gleamed under lights that had been calibrated to make paint colors look deeper than physics should allow. A current year Porsche sat on a raised platform in the center of the floor, like an offering. They went inside. The air was cool and faintly scented with something meant to suggest leather and consequence. Two sales associates stood near the entrance in fitted blazers, positioned like sentries. Their eyes moved over Garrett and Rosie with the specific trained evaluation of people whose commission depended on reading customers. And the evaluation was brief. Garrett found the parts counter. Rear of the building, past the showroom, where the actual work happened. A young man behind the counter was logging inventory. Landon, order for a distributor cap and rotor 240Z application. Called yesterday. The kid typed, "One moment." Rosie was standing beside him, studying a framed technical poster on the wall. A cutaway of a flat six engine, the kind of detailed illustration that showed every component in cross-section. Her eyes moved across it with the slow, careful attention Garrett recognized because it was identical to his own. "The oil cooler's on the wrong side," she said quietly. Garrett looked. She was right. The diagram had a minor inaccuracy in the cooler placement. The kind of error nobody would notice on a wall poster in a service department. Nobody except the daughter of a man who'd spent his 20s designing systems that operated at the boundary of mechanical possibility. "Good eye," he said. She nodded, satisfied, and went back to examining the poster. The trouble arrived in dress shoes. Garrett heard them first, hard soles on polished concrete. The deliberate percussion of someone who walked like they expected the floor to be grateful. "Excuse me." Garrett turned. The man was mid-40s, tall, groomed with the intensity of someone who considered his appearance a professional instrument. Jacket that cost more than Garrett's monthly grocery budget. Hair that had been shaped rather than cut. Name tag, Preston Greaves, service director. He was looking at Garrett with an expression Garrett had seen before. The particular species of contempt that didn't bother disguising itself because it didn't consider its object worth the effort. "Can I help you?" Greaves said in the way that meant the opposite. Already being helped. Parts pickup. Greaves's gaze traveled down. The work boots with concrete dust in the treads, the flannel shirt with a frayed cuff, the 5-year-old in rain boots and a hand-me-down jacket, holding a stuffed rabbit and a composition notebook. "This is a showroom environment," Greaves said. "We maintain a pause that was doing the work of several unspoken words, standard of presentation for our clientele." The kid behind the counter had stopped typing. "I'm at the parts counter," Garrett said. His voice was level. "In the service wing, which is where the parts counter is. I think you might be more comfortable at a facility that's more..." Another pause. "Aligned with your needs." Rosie had turned around. She was looking at Greaves with the direct, undiluted gaze of a 5-year-old who understood that something was wrong even if she couldn't name it. She held Professor a little tighter. Garrett felt the choice arrive. The one between making a scene that his daughter would remember and walking out with his dignity held in the specific way that only a person who has been underestimated can hold it, like a tool he knew how to use. "We're picking up parts," he said. "Then we're leaving. That's the whole interaction." He turned back to the counter. The kid had the box ready. Garrett signed the receipt, took the parts, and walked out with Rosie's hand in his. He didn't look at Greaves again. He didn't need to. Some people told you everything about themselves in 30 seconds, and the only appropriate response was to let them. In the truck, Rosie was quiet for almost a full minute. Then, "That man was not nice. No, he didn't like our clothes. It wasn't about our clothes, Rosie." She thought about this. What was it about? Garrett started the engine. "It was about him," he said, "not about us." She seemed to accept this with the provisional trust of someone who would revisit it later when she had more information. She opened her notebook and began drawing something. He glanced over. It was the flat 6 from the poster, the one with the oil cooler on the wrong side. She was drawing it with the cooler in the correct position. 3 hours later, in her glass-walled office above the Caldwell Automotive showroom, Marin Caldwell was running out of options. The car was a 1965 Shelby Cobra 427. It belonged to a man named Arthur Pemberton, industrialist, collector, and the single most important private client Caldwell Automotive had cultivated in its 40-year history. The Pemberton Heritage Motor Exhibition was 11 days away. The Cobra was the centerpiece, and the Cobra would not start. It had been refusing for 3 weeks. 3 specialists had examined it. 2 had offered theories. None had fixed it. The engine would turn over, idle roughly for 15 to 20 seconds, and die. Every diagnostic pointed somewhere different. The problem was intermittent and specific, and it was making Maren Caldwell question whether she'd built her reputation on a foundation that couldn't handle the one situation where it actually mattered. She'd been searching. Deep searches now, past the obvious specialists, into the corners of the internet, where engineers talked to each other in language that assumed fluency. On the 3rd page of a technical forum archive from 7 years ago, she found a thread about intermittent fuel delivery failures in side-oiler FE block engines modified for competition use. The thread was 12 posts long. The final post described a diagnostic methodology for a specific failure mode that matched the Cobra's symptoms precisely. The post was detailed, rigorous, and signed with a real name. Garrett Landon. Maren searched the name. The results assembled themselves into a picture that made her sit very still. Le Mans. Sebring. Patents. Vortex propulsion systems. 370 million. Then silence. A personal loss mentioned in an industry newsletter. A business listing. Landon and Sons, south end of Crestfield. 25 minutes away. She checked the parts counter records. Landon. Today's date. She went downstairs. She found the counter associate. She asked about the interaction. She listened. She went back upstairs. She sat at her desk for a long moment. Then she pulled Preston Greaves's personnel file and picked up the phone. The line rang 3 times. A woman answered. Impact wrench in the background. Landon and Sons, this is Tessa. I'm trying to reach Garrett Landon. My name is Maren Caldwell. A pause, hold on. 2 minutes of hold. She spent them trying to figure out what to say and finding that every version was wrong. This is Garrett. Even voice. Not cold, not warm. Waiting. Mr. Landon, I'm calling about 2 things. The first is to apologize for what happened at my dealership this morning. I've reviewed the situation. What you and your daughter experienced was unacceptable, and I'm sorry. Silence. Okay, he said. The second thing. She paused. I found a forum post you wrote about 7 years ago. Fuel delivery diagnostics for a side-oiler FE variant in a competition-modified chassis. I have a 1965 Shelby Cobra 427 with the exact fault profile you described. I have 11 days before it needs to be running for a private exhibition. 3 specialists have failed. A different silence. The quality of someone hearing something they hadn't expected. That's an old post, he said. The problem's older. She could hear the garage. Metal sounds. Air compressor. Rosie's voice somewhere distant, asking Tessa something. I'm not consulting, he said. I'm asking for one visit. Look at the car. If it's not something you want to take on, you leave and I keep searching. This isn't about money. I know. It's about whether the problem is interesting enough. Long silence. Tomorrow evening, he said. After 7, after Rosie's in bed. No promises. I'll be there at 7. He hung up. Maren set the phone down. She looked through the glass at her showroom, her building, her name. The building where a man and his daughter had been treated like they didn't belong, while she sat 2 floors up not knowing it was happening. She pulled Greaves's file toward her and read it with the attention of someone who had already decided and was confirming the facts. He came the next evening, and the evening after that, and the evening after that. The Cobra sat in a climate-controlled storage bay beneath the main building, surrounded by 8 other vehicles from Pemberton's collection. Garrett walked around it once the first night without touching it. Then he opened his tool bag and began. Maren watched. Not hovering. Present. She asked questions that followed from what he explained, not filler, not performance. Real questions. She'd been researching. She knew more about this engine than she'd known about any engine in her life, and she knew it wasn't enough, and she was honest about the gap. On the second evening, he found it. A combination of factors that no single specialist could have identified, because no single specialist had the specific intersection of knowledge this problem required. A fuel pump eccentric that had been machined during a previous rebuild to a tolerance that was correct for the standard application, but wrong for the competition modification, combined with a float level that had drifted over decades, and a fuel return line that had been routed differently from the factory's spec, probably during a modification in the early 70s. Each factor alone was within tolerance. Together, they created a cascade failure in the fuel delivery system that only manifested under specific thermal conditions during cold start. It was the kind of problem that would have defeated diagnostic indefinitely because every individual component tested fine. He explained this to Marin at 10:30 on a Wednesday night while they stood over the open engine bay. She listened with the complete attention of a person who understood that she was watching something rare. "The eccentric needs to be remachined," he said. "I can do it at my shop. The float level's a 20-minute adjustment. The fuel return line I'll reroute to the original spec tomorrow night." "Will it run?" He looked at the engine. The 60-year-old American V8 that had been built to go fast and had spent the last 3 weeks refusing to go at all. "It'll run," he said. On the fourth evening it ran. Marin stood 15 feet away when Garrett turned the key and the 427 caught and held and settled into an idle that was deep and steady and correct. The sound filled the storage bay, the sound of a machine doing what it was built to do. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "Thank you." He wiped his hands on a shop rag. The eccentric was the interesting part. At the exhibition, Rosie wore her rain boots. Nobody commented. She moved through Pemberton's collection with her notebook open, drawing cross-sections of vehicles that most adults in the room were afraid to stand too close to. She had a conversation with Pemberton himself about the cooling system layout of a 1957 Jaguar D-Type that lasted 6 minutes and left the 72-year-old industrialist visibly recalibrating his understanding of what 5-year-olds were capable of. "That child of yours," Pemberton said to Garrett afterward. "Yeah. She told me the header wrap on the D-Type was reducing thermal efficiency rather than improving it. She said it with complete conviction. She's usually right about that kind of thing." Pemberton studied him. "What are you going to do with her?" "Right now, I'm going to let her be 5. Marin walked them out at the end of the evening. Rosie was fading, the gradual deflation of a small person who'd spent her full charge. Professor was dragging on the ground. The notebook was closed. "Thank you for letting me come," Rosie said, very seriously. "Thank you for coming," Marin said. "You made it better." Rosie accepted this and walked ahead toward the truck, boots scuffing on the gravel drive. Garrett and Marin stood at the top of the steps. The November air was sharp. Inside, the murmur of the gathering was a warm sound against the cold. "I'm going to call you next week," she said. "Not about cars, or not only about cars." He looked at her. "Coffee," she said. "For 2 people who are better at work than they are at whatever this is." "I don't move fast," he said. "At anything. I'm not asking for fast. I'm asking for coffee." "Okay. Okay." He went down the steps and caught up with Rosie and walked her to the truck. In the rear view, pulling out, he could see the lit entrance of the estate, Marin still standing at the top of the steps before she turned and went back inside. Rosie fell asleep before they reached the main road. Professor was in her lap. The notebook was open to the last drawing she'd been working on. A cross-section of an engine he recognized. The Cobra's 427. Every major component represented in the emphatic, imprecise, deeply attentive style of someone who was only beginning to understand how much there was to understand. He drove in the silence of a November night with his sleeping daughter and thought about things the way you think about them when there's no pressure to conclude anything. He thought about the showroom on Monday, the contempt, the 30-second decision he'd made while his daughter watched him. He thought about Abigail's coffee maker and the ceramic bowl on the windowsill and the way grief got lighter, not because it mattered less, but because you learned to carry it differently. He thought about a forum post from 7 years ago, written in a life that felt like someone else's, and how the things you knew had a way of mattering eventually, in ways you couldn't plan for. He thought about what Tessa would say when he told her about Pemberton's offer to consult on the rest of his collection. She would say, obviously, in the specific way she said things she'd already known. She'd be right. He pulled into the driveway, killed the engine, sat in the quiet. Rosie opened one eye. "Home? Home." She closed the eye. The car sounded really good. "It did. That's because you fixed it." He looked at his daughter for a long moment. The tangled hair, the rabbit, the notebook, the rain boots, the absolute certainty of a child who believed in her father with a completeness that was the most important thing in his life. "Come on," he said softly. "Let's go inside." He carried her in. The house was warm and dark. The hallway nightlight was on. Rosie barely stirred through the transfer from truck to bed, the boots coming off, the blanket pulled up. Professor went on the pillow. The notebook went on the nightstand, open to the drawing of the 427. Garrett stood in the doorway. Outside, November was settling in. The fence still needed staining. The lawnmower engine was still on the porch. There was a lot of ordinary life ahead. School pickups and parts orders and fleet invoices and the quiet rhythms of a small garage that did good work. But ahead of it too now, Pemberton's list, Marin's coffee. The first call from someone who'd heard that a problem everyone else had given up on had been solved in 4 evenings by a mechanic on the south end of town. He was not the man who had disappeared 3 years ago. That man had been running because standing still felt like drowning. He was someone different now. Someone who had chosen stillness, lived inside it, and was only beginning to understand that the stillness had never been the destination. It had been the repair. And repair, when it was done right, wasn't the end of the machine. It was the machine finding its correct running state again. He turned off the kitchen light and went to bed in the house that had been Abigail's, and then Grief's, and then his and Rosie's, with the November cold pressing at the windows, and the hallway nightlight keeping its post. And for the first time in 3 years he fell asleep without weight, and did not dream of anything that hurt. The morning would come. It always did. And there was work in it worth doing, and a 5-year-old who would wake up and carry a stuffed rabbit to breakfast and draw engines in a composition notebook, with the confident imprecision of someone who was only at the beginning of understanding how much there was to understand. The morning would come, and this time Garrett Landon was ready for it.